So the first thing I want to say is that Michelle is absolutely right about the war on drugs, and that's what most of her talk was about and what most of the book is about. But drug offenders make up 25% of those in our nation's prisons and jails. So we have 2.3 million prisoners. 550,000 of them are drug offenders, that is either possession or sale. 25% drug offenders, 50% are violent offenders, and 25% are property offenders. And this is looking at federal, state, and jails altogether. The reason I mention those numbers is that as compelling as the critique of the war on drugs is, it is not going to be the basis for ending mass incarceration, in my opinion. Because if we were to release all 550,000 of the nation's drug offenders tomorrow, we would still have the world's largest prison system. We would still have 1.8 million prisoners, which would put us ahead of China at number 2. So we've got to, as compelling as it is, we can't stop with the easiest and most sympathetic type of prisoner, which is the drug offender, as compared to these other categories. There's another reason that we have to talk about violence, in my opinion, beyond the fact that violent offenders are 50% of our prisons. And that is that the same disproportions that Michelle documents so compellingly in our prison system are also true of victims of violence. So in the same way that young black men are massively overrepresented in the prison system, poor young blacks, men especially, and some women are massively disproportionately represented as victims of violence and as offenders. So young black men between the ages of 15 and 24 are more likely to be victims of fatal and non-fatal violence than any other group. In 2006, the homicide death rate for young black men was 19 times higher than the rate for young white men. And most of that crime is intra-racial, within the same race. And in my opinion, not in this group, fortunately, because we talked a little bit about violence this morning, but typically there's one set of people that's talking about mass incarceration, and there's another set of people entirely that's talking about violence and victimization. And I think those of us that care about mass incarceration have got to have front and center in our conversation the question of violence as well. Because somebody else, and normally someone with many more punitive motives than us, is going to be talking about it if we're not. There's another difference, and this is not an area where Michelle and I would disagree, but I think it's worth pointing out. It is true that there were some people that did better than others within the old Jim Crow. But one thing that we really should be clear about when we talk about mass incarceration, and one way in which, in my opinion, it's not like Jim Crow, is that mass incarceration is so precisely targeted on a very specific part of our community, which is the poorest and least educated parts of our community. And in my mind, that's a real difference that we need to address and discuss. So, the incarceration numbers that Michelle described, all true. Here's another one. A black man of my generation, born in the late 1960s, is more than twice as likely to go to prison in his lifetime than a black man of my father's generation. Now that is phenomenal given all of the things that happened between my father's generation and mine. I was born after the Voting Rights Act, after the Civil Rights Act, after the Fair Housing Act. And a black man of my generation is more than twice as likely to go to prison. But check this. That's not true for black men of my generation with college degrees. It is so for a black man of my generation who has gone to college, the likelihood of going to prison in his lifetime has not increased at all as compared to a black man of my father's generation. Where the increase has been, and it's been dramatic, the increase has been absolutely concentrated on black high school dropouts. And this is a story that this is now a theme, right, that we're seeing across panels, because some of this came up in the education conversation as well. The victim of mass incarceration is who Jeff talked about last night, that 27-year-old who came to him who had never worked, who had been in prison. And my guess is, although Jeff didn't talk about this, statistically most likely was a high school dropout. That difference in terms of how targeted mass incarceration is, I think raises fundamental issues for this group. It raises the question, what does it mean to talk about the black community? Right? What is our community? And who's part of it? Who's part of the community? And what obligations do we owe to each other? Last night, the call from Marion, from Jeff, from Angela, was that this is the worst time our community has seen since slavery. That's not true for all of us. And it's not just, I want to be clear about this, it's not just Obama and Oprah and a couple of other people who are better off. It's a lot of us who are significantly better off than we were in a previous generation. There are opportunities for large swaths of the black community that did not exist in our parents' and grandparents' generation. Would you rather have been born in 1850, 1910, 1940, 1950? Statistically, in 1967, 1 in 100 black families made $75,000 a year. 1 in 100. Using inflation-adjusted dollars, that's now 20%. So we've gone from 1% to 20% from 1967 to today. That's a significant swath of the community that now has access to a middle-class lifestyle. But it is true, and this is where Michelle's book is so valuable, it is true that there remains a significant portion of the community that is trapped and is trapped in a very real way, like they were trapped in previous generations, although the institutions trapping them are different. But I do think we have to be specific when we talk about, is this the worst time since slavery? We have to be real clear about who in the community that we're talking about, because if we're not specific, we will come up with solutions. Tomorrow I know we're going to talk about solutions, but if we're not precise, we'll come up with solutions that don't meet the problem. And this is another terrific part of the book, where Michelle criticizes the civil rights community that she was part of for focusing more on affirmative action than on mass incarceration. And that kind of focus, though, will come if you're not precise about the problem.